This is the third in a four-part lecture on schooling, psychometric testing and eugenics, drawing from the book Benign Violence, Education in and Beyond the Age of Reason. Parts 1 and 2 have explored the early development of conceptions of intelligence. Here I will explore how those developments connected to assumptions about the regulation of social life. On the question of intelligence and its relation to social life, one crucial point of clarification was provided. As Francis Galton, the founder of Eugenics, and his successors argued, intelligence is distributed continuously in a population from very low intelligence to very high intelligence. In that sense, it is a relative matter. The intelligence of a specific individual can only be described in its relation to the normal distribution of other intelligences. But it was also argued that the relativity of intelligence operates on a socio-temporal axis too. As Henry Goddard, a later eugenicist, would have it, the social significance of each particular level of intelligence is, to quote Galton, fixed not arbitrarily, but by the social necessity, end quote, which itself is a function of historical progress. The boundary between lower so-called normality and upper abnormality is defined here as the point at which a person cannot deal adequately with his or her environment. Galton knew that and was explicit that this was what was happening. He did not claim that normality was an absolute value, that the border of normality was an absolute human characteristic. It was always a socially contingent value. Norms would change as societies change. Social environments, we are told, are graded in complexity just as much as intelligence. Here, Goddard cites Binet, who points out that normal intelligence is a relative matter, and that which is sufficient for a French peasant out in the country is not sufficient for a Frenchman in Paris, end quote. Some types will have, he writes, intelligence enough to live in certain environments and care for themselves, but in a more complex social group it is impossible for them to function properly, end quote. As civilization advanced, the bar was raised. This at least is the argument. The persons, he writes, who constitute our social problems are of a type that in the past and under simpler environments have seemed responsible and able to function normally. The difficulty for them today is that the present environment has become too complex, end quote. We can see in this rationale how arguments for national self-defense against the pernicious effects of those who were judged defective or subnormal are justified in terms that are defined by the nature of the society to be defended. This is crucial. According to this argument, the contextually specific demands of a complex society designate the point at which a citizen who fails to cope thereby becomes a threat to that society. The nature of society is appealed to and used to justify a line of distinction between those that society will make live and those that it will effectively let die. This does not have to entail murder as such, but also every form of indirect murder, the fact of exposing someone to death, increasing the risk of death, or, quite simply, political death, expulsion, rejection, and so on, to which we must add institutionalization and sterilization. Here, with eugenics and the early development of psychometric testing, as well as arguments for how the institutionalization of children might connect with a more docile and economically productive society, we have an exemplary case of the kind of self-referential thinking and justification that is definitive of what Michel Foucault called biopower. This is a logic of government where the population is both the object of government and the source of guidance as to how that government should operate. Intelligence is defined in terms of social necessity. It is defined in terms of population level requirements and yet, at the same time, it is the device used for managing a population. I will return to biopower in a moment. First, a little more about the early development of intelligence testing. During the First World War, a group of psychologists contributed to the war effort by ranking army recruits according to their mental abilities. Goddard and Terman joined a group of scientists led by Robert Yerkes. Their leader was a eugenicist and a primate expert. Several years later, he was teaching table manners to chimpanzees. In 1917, Yerkes published recommendations for converting the Stanford-Binet age-based scale to a point scale. This would make test data more amenable to statistical analysis. The Binet tests had always been limited in this respect. That is to say, in the construction of previous tests, specific activities were matched to the age at which a normal child was expected to achieve mastery. For example, a normal 5-year-old child was expected to name certain colours, and a normal 8-year-old child was expected to count backwards from 20 to 0, for instance. These assumptions were then verified by testing them on a sample of children. Roughly speaking, the problem with this approach is that the test was limited to a specific group of children for whom the tasks were devised. These tests were useless in other contexts, being inflexible by design. With a point scale approach, however, the tasks were less specific to context. They were no longer selected to match a certain age, and each task was divided into stages of difficulty. Though age as a criterion for task selection was no longer important, norms could still be established in retrospect for each different age. Indeed, norms could now be established for any variable in a population. In addition, once these tests were administered to increasing numbers of people, they would become increasingly reliable. Any new group could be tested, so long as a sufficient number of initial examinations were conducted in order to establish preliminary norms. As Yerkes explained, the test was now universally applicable. So, an exploratory norm-generating device had replaced its precursor, which had been limited to a specific population, relying as it did on certain preconceived ideas about what members of that population should be able to do at a particular age. Here, we now have a tool designed to discover the norms and traits of particular groups, a tool that would claim to have developed a non-biased, culturally and socially non-specific platform of discernment. I will explore the significance of this transition in the next part, the final part of this 4-part lecture.